So you mentioned partway through telling your favorite drug experience, you mentioned your experiment or let's say polling sort of exercise that you do with a crowd about opioids. Have you ever taken a painkiller? I named you and I talked about that exercise in my testimony to an Oklahoma Congress lately. And I used that exercise and then I said, it's all right, so that's anecdotal, but it's a microcosm of this data, and I explained it. So there was a question, let's see, I should pull it up, about that exercise, which if just to revisit it really quickly, you'll say to an audience, have you ever taken a painkiller, a narcotic painkiller? Just about everyone will raise their hands. Most adults have taken painkillers for something, some procedure. And then you'll say, okay, any of you ever become addicted to it? Did you become addicted to it? Or are you addicted now? And no, hardly anyone raises their hands. And so then you ask them why, and you get a good, it's like a motivational interviewing with a crowd. You get a good explanation of why wouldn't someone get addicted to a painkiller? And that can kind of lead you into why would someone, and then how would you help that person be more like you? So the question was, this is actually from someone who saw my testimony and asked, for you, when you do your polling of have you ever taken a painkiller, has anyone ever copped to becoming addicted to it? And how would you respond to that? Or how have you responded to that?
Good question. And people say, well, they're not going to admit to being, addicted to that. In my memoir, I asked Jacob to write something, and Jacob uses that exercise. He'll get on with a guy who says, well, he'll do that thing that we've talked about. Well, 1 in 3 people who take a painkiller become addicted. And so he's been on a panel, Jacob, with somebody who says that, and then Jacob does my exercise. Mm-hmm. But Jacob does a variation that I now do. Because, somebody will say, well, nobody's going to admit it. So Jacob says, well, did anybody really find it very alluring so that they wanted to do more, which is a way to edge into the question, because somebody can sort of raise their hands to that. And then I call on that person, and there's only a handful of people who do that. And then the person gives an answer that's hard to fake. You know what I mean? They go, well, I said, wow, I really like this experience. But then after a couple of days, I had to, pack my kids off to school. Or, I had to do this complicated part. They give an answer that, isn't a fake answer. It's a real life answer. So it's like any kind of motivational interviewing. Well, I do the same thing. If you ever can find the video of me, I think it's on my website, on the Oprah Winfrey Show. It was an AA type audience that was very hostile to me. And every time somebody started talking about AA, I would say, well, tell me about your actual AA experience. And nobody's actual AA experience was actually an AA experience. Mm. A person would say, well, I quit drinking before I went to AA. Or I was still drinking in AA. There's so many variations of it. And then you get a genuine response, and you can really get into that. So you can do the same thing with the question of the audience. But people in the audience, you can get a general feeling when people are answering that there's not a ton of people, not 1 in 3 people, as you point out, it's consistent with epidemiological data, are becoming addicted to opioids. Simply reflecting on that in their own lives should make them aware that it's not inherently addictive. And we have another accompanying podcast to this where Anna Lemke, who's she says, well, 25% of people become addicted to painkillers who take them. And, Michael Keaton in drugs in Dope Sick claims that over half his patients became addicted to that. Those are clearly impossible. They imply that the drug inherently lures people into the addiction. If people can only free themselves and reflect on their own experiences, how they reacted, either not finding it particularly pleasant, or if they did find some pull from it, just saying, well, it's not possible to make this a part of my life.
And so the reason I like the question here is maybe this is just the way that I interpreted it, is just the same way that you can have a sampling kind of a bias when you skew data like Anna Lemke did. You could say that if you're talking to professionals, a lot of times you could have a sampling bias where, of course, the crowd that you're talking to is not going to become addicted. Still useful, but let's say you're talking to a room full of people who say that they're recovering from opioid. So then you'd get the answer from almost everybody, yes, I became addicted. And so what do you do with that? How do you lead them? I imagine that there's something constructive that you can take from that. And
well, first of all, the claim that's made there, the disease claim is, and the model of opioid addiction is some normal quote person who lives a regular life goes in, they got hurt their knee, and they start getting painkillers and they become a drug addict. That's the story.
Right.
And in the history of the world, that's happened, but it hardly ever happens. I do have an alternative exercise. So that's a good point. It's a sampling problem. I mean, in the Brian Cressy board, Brian Cressy is a low probability, drug addict, and so are most of the other members of the board. And that's often true, and I'm surprised how often it's true in the professional groups I meet. I use a different exercise with recovering groups. My exercise with them is, what's the toughest addiction to quit? And they always shout out smoking. And they say, oh, that's really interesting to know. Has anybody in this room quit smoking? Now, remember, even if I'm in a recovery group, I'm in a recovery group of people who are now professionals. I mean, that's the context that I do these things in. And they'll say, oh, and more than half the audience raise their hand, hundreds of people. And they'll say, how many of you use either a drug to recover or recovered by joining a support group? There really aren't mainly support groups for smoking. And sometimes nobody will raise their hand, or maybe one or two people will raise their hand. And then I go, why did you quit smoking? And then they give the same normal answers. I had a child. And then sometimes they'll say, well, I tried repeatedly 5 or 7 times. And I say, well, how many years did that take? And they said, oh, it took years. And I say, well, okay. So what you're all telling me is that you recovered from the toughest drug addiction there is to quit, which isn't illegal. You did it for normal human reasons. Sometimes it can be painstakingly slow, but, better late than never. And so you're adumbrating the same human experience in a slightly different fashion with a group of people, who are recovery people, and finding out how they recovered. And the underlying story with both the opioid and the smoking thing is the same. I got to a point in life where I had enough of an alternative life that the addiction became a non sequitur. And by the way, people give up opioids more readily than they give up smoking, like those people said. On the ongoing surveys, the average, they call it a half-life, the median point at which people quit smoking, they've been dependent on nicotine or smoking for over 20 years. For alcohol, it's 12 years. For cocaine, it's, for marijuana, it's 6 years. And for cocaine, it's 5 years. It's harder to stay, and opioids are in that bottom pile too. It's hard to get enough people for a survey like that. The point is, the more you have in life, the less likely you're going to be addicted or continue your addiction. And the more disruptive something is to your life, actually, the more readily you are likely to quit it, the less likely you can fit it into your life. So the same life experience model is borne out by the epidemiological data, by human experience and common sense, and by even asking people to plumb their own experiences.
So if you're at a place, let's see if I can reflect that. if you're at a place and you ask people to do that exercise, and some people say, well, I've become addicted to opioids. First of all, you're saying you do have an alternative exercise that deals with that from a slightly different perspective. Let's take a more difficult drug to quit, usually tobacco or cigarettes, nicotine. And you can ask people, why did you quit?
But if that person says that, what's my first immediate question?
What's that? I didn't hear.
If that person says, oh, I did become addicted to opioids, what's my first immediate question?
You want to
know? I'm going to get a no answer if I ask the follow-up question. What's that?
Are you still addicted?
Right.
Right. And so that's what I'm
going to be at some workshop.
That's what I'm getting to. So then there's something to work with there, because you can ask the question, well, how'd you kick that habit? I think what you were saying is there's some kind of a web you have to untangle sometimes when it comes to opioids, because they're like villainous or something. So you never know when someone's going to have the story. Well, I kicked the habit because I'm true to my program, and that's the only thing keeping me alive. You could still work with that. I mean, you could still say, tell me about your program. What are the life skills you've learned? But so on one hand, it's a little easier to do this in a way that with something like tobacco, where there's no real big mythology around. But if you had to, you can do the same experience by getting people to talk about. Let
me throw back a difficult question to you. You're familiar with the operation of methadone clinics, which often convince people they can't quit the methadone.
Mm-hmm.
How do you react? And so there are people on methadone. Is that methadone or methadone?
Methadone, I think. I don't know. I'd say methadone.
For a long time. How would you deal with people who are comfortable in that, believe they sort of have to be that way, and may have been therapized to believe that? How do you deal with that not quitting addiction type setup?
So how do you deal with somebody who feels that they have kicked an addiction but still feel reliant on a methadone or Suboxone or something like that too? I'm still curious about what it was that helped them leave their addiction behind. Has your life changed since you were getting drugs from the streets or using other kinds of opioids to now? And what was that experience like? And, I'm not boosterish one way or another. I wouldn't put high pressure on somebody one way or another. That's kind of the nature of motivational interviewing. But I would ask, to what extent is that the methadone doing the work, and to what extent is that you doing the work? What part of your identity is wrapped around methadone? What part of your identity is just you as a person? And help them, get through that with me for a little bit.
One of the best things, I'm sometimes somewhere with Maya Salovitz. One of the best things I ever saw her do was to describe why it was good to go to a methadone clinic or a needle exchange clinic, Safe Needles place. And she'll say, it's very moving to say, well, this is the first time I've been with people who cared whether I lived or died.
Yeah.
So step one is, why are you with a methadone? I mean, you used to use drugs in the street, now you're a methadone. And why is that an improvement for you? And the answer is, I care now whether I live or die, and I'm taking. And then the second part of that is, and this gets back, needle exchange programs have been proven to actually decrease people's, because you are saying to them, well, we're going to give you clean needles. You might take something that is, intravenous, you might quit. And they're in a step process where they sort of have never done anything ever before to do something healthy for themselves. And now they're doing something. And so you're saying, that's the question you were asking is, well, you used to be in a worse place than being in this methadone clinic. You were on the street and who knows what you were taking, and you couldn't have a regular life. What enabled you to make that transition? That's a self-efficacy, an agency question. And you're exploring with them their agency in getting that way. The problem with Suboxone and all that, those medications are, and everybody knows this, a lot of people are going to quit.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, well, when they quit, what happens? They just go back to street drugs or have something, which gets back to our very first question, or I think, or what medications do you approve of? I think, and I think Aaron backs this up, there are a rather large group of people. He said something, I think, Aaron, like, well, the average length of time in he's a outreach person for an MAT or an MOUD agency, which are giant now. The average time on, I think he's talking about Suboxone or buprenorphine, is about 2 years. That people there's natural recovery from MAT.
Yeah.
Unless there's a small group that doesn't and become lifetimers around methadone or whatever. But even within that context, and some of them are just wanting to, I want to go back to the street, but an awful lot of them are saying, well, okay, I think I could graduate from this on my own.
So you have to have the guts and the honesty to ask the question. A lot of people, they just stop taking these replacement drugs. You're free to take them. I mean, we'll give them to you as long as you want them. Let's say that you got to a point in your life where you hit that crossroads. What would you be thinking? What would make you have that decision? What would be going on? Just the same way that what got you here, right?
Exactly. And there is a completely parallel process, and the data are clear there. There are people who quit smoking, and there are people who quit smoking with nicotine replacement therapy. Mm-hmm. And, most people aren't going to take NRA, nicotine replacement forever. Mm-hmm. And the data show that they're more a person, no matter how severe, and more so if they're severely dependent, if they quit, and the answer to this seems obvious. If they did it by NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, they're much more likely to several times more likely to relax than if they just quit on their own. It's not a clinical trial. They're just measuring things with those people. And so obviously, if you're a therapist involved in that situation, exactly, you're likely to say, sometimes people quit the, substitute for whatever reasons. What's that? Can you envision or be mindful of what that would be like? How do you think you react? And what would make you react in the way that you most positively want to react, which is, probably not.
And you might even say, could you imagine a life circumstance that would make it difficult for you to continue taking these medications, sort of like it was difficult for you to get Adderall? And if that arose, you could talk about that as like, what would be impeding on your ability to move forward if some circumstance happened? Just a thought experiment to help people tug on their agency a little bit.
And the answer to that question is a tricky one. The number one reason that people quit whatever is because of family. And this comes out in Gene Hayman's research. The single sort of reason that most people quit whatever, heroin, smoking, alcohol, drugs, is they sort of want their family to be proud of them, which sort of gets back to an earlier question we dealt with. And that you make use of as a clinician. You want people to feel you're on their team. You want them to know what'll make your life better, but you want to put it in a positive way. You don't want to say, oh, I'll kill you or I'll never talk to you again, right, unless you stop doing A, B, or C. Well, that's been done. But you want to incorporate their regard for you and their wanting to incur your respect and love as a positive reinforcer. So, I'm one way of putting that is, in a nutshell, would be to say, oh God, I'd be so happy. It would make me so happy if that ever happened for you. I'm not pushing you, but that would, it would just increase my love and respect for you as high as it is already.
So we have, I'm not going to add I've had something else to add, but we have a couple more questions. I'd love to get to them all if you have the energy for it. Okay, so one here says, I'm in chronic pain and using opioids. Oh, this is a pain patient who I think also follows me on Twitter, and I think also saw that Oklahoma testimony I gave. I'm a chronic pain patient and using opioids to manage it. I would say I'm dependent on the pills for my well-being. I don't know what alternative there really could be to manage the pain. I'm not only taking pills all day. I do a lot of other self-care as well. But opioids are a major part of my wellness right now. They minimize my suffering. Do you agree that I'm dependent on those drugs? Do you think that I'm addicted to them? So I think this is in the chronic pain patient community, they're trying to use those terms as sort of liberation, that you can be dependent on them but not addicted to them. I don't know that this is a person who is like read your work or heard, you try to marry the two concepts, but that's an interesting kind of a follow-up to things we've talked about before. Like, is there a difference between addiction and dependence in the case that somebody sort of is just suffering and does rely on the drugs, but what else are they going to do? They're trying to do other things, but right now the drugs are the only thing giving them solace.
Well, in the other part of this podcast, we had a big discussion pretty much around this issue.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sort of a mini war going on within medicine. There are people who deal with pain, and they say, well, these people are in pain. And then there's a group of people who say, well, all opioids are addictive. And so even within the medical community, that debate that you just described, which is a little bit of a ideology, it's a epistemology, what's a use of words definition? Well, they're dependent, but they're not addicted. And the way you and I would put it is the use of this substance adding to or detracting from your life? I mean, that's a simplification, but if the person's saying, well, I can't go out in the street unless, and I can't function without this drug, that's a clear answer on one side. If the person says, well, I'm using it because I have to, but it's just making me incapable of getting out of bed, these are extreme answers, well, then, you're in a bad place. And so, that's a balancing act. And the point of motivational interviewing, the point of changing, the point of drug policy reform, and where we're going to have to go, we've discussed this, we'll discuss it again. There has to be a drug rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
People, there's just now in California, they've just, the ACLU is saying homelessness, we're not going to use the term homeless person, we're just going to use the term people, and people have a right to have a home. Homelessness is not a condition. It's not a thing. And we can do the same thing with drug use. Drug use is not a condition. It's people using drugs, and they have a right to use drugs, and they have to ultimately make their own decision about whether they're going to use drugs, which drugs to use, and how to use drugs. And there are cases, many cases, Pat Denning's a perfect example of trying to help people deal with that in a way that's less destructive for them and conceivably moves them in a direction of using fewer or not using the drug at all. But that's the discussion, and where the discussion needs to take place, rather than labeling something inherently addictive, labeling somebody's behavior as necessarily addictive. Well, if you take it every day, there are people who say if you have a drink every day, you're an alcoholic. But rather to do that balancing act, both in working with the person and being helpful, but in terms of policy, and just saying, well, people have a right to drugs, and they have a right to decide, and we want to encourage them to decide rather than imposing it on them, that they're using it in a more or less helpful way. And if they think it's more harmful, we'll help them. So this person sort of answered, the person who asked the question sort of answered it. They sort of said, well, I'm active and I do a lot of things. And so it's like a harm reduction interaction. It's like a motivational interviewing action. And then you would say to them, are there any points that you're a little bit worried about around that issue? Is there something that made you ask that question? Because if it's true, if what you're saying is true, there's no problem. Do you perceive any anxieties or doubts about having a problem? And what are those? And what are alternatives for dealing with that, including alternative methods of pain relief or other ways of using your pain medication?
Right. So you can always consider whether there are alternatives without having to beat yourself up about the fact that you're doing the best you can for now. That just goes across the board. I mean, that's in everyone in every life circumstance. There's to really thread the needle on that. I've talked to you about this woman, Stanford psychologist. Her name is Beth Darnell. She kind of took a 180 on her position about opioids. She works with people who are taking opioids for this reason, who are suffering in pain, and they are taking the opioids because, well, they don't like it sometimes to take them, and they give them some ill effects, but it sure beats the pain. So they felt like they're in the same position as this person, where they are reliant on the drug to alleviate their suffering so they can actually live, but they don't love the effects of the drug. And she sees these people and explores with them, are there attractive alternatives that you haven't thought about? And are there things that you can work into your life that take away the downsides of the drug? And eventually, if what you want to do is taper off the drug a little bit, or take slightly less or less often, or not have to rely on them so much, maybe there's a way we could do that. And she was on the same panel as me saying, I can't do this job if you're making a mandate that people have to stop taking drugs. You can't say, all right, let's cut off your drug supply and then I'll work with you on like mindfulness strategies. You have to let people take what they want to take, as you were saying.
Is she, I think you said she's a psychologist.
Yeah. She's a pain psychologist.
You're going to have to send her our link to the Anna Lemke tape.
Yeah, I think she might like that. She has to share walls with Anna Lemke, by the way. She's at Stanford also. So,
does she actually work with her?
I don't know that she works. I would guess that she doesn't work with her, but
I would guess not. Anna Lemke's the head of, I think, Stanford's whatever.
Yeah, addiction psychiatry
clinical program.
Right.
Maybe we'll really cause some internal dissension at Stanford.
Okay. I actually will reach out. I want to reach out to Beth Darnell so we could have her on soon. This question says, what can one say to a person who takes a moral-based position on substance use? For example, if one says, quote, I'll only give a homeless person food because otherwise they'll spend their money on drugs, end quote. I'm not naive enough to believe that I could say anything that would change one's position, but is there anything that could be said that might make such a person think more broadly, less black and white, regarding the use of substances? Does Dr. Peele have a response that might help one view substance use as something other than deviant or antisocial behavior? So I guess how do you crack? We talk a lot about how to persuade people to think a little differently than the addiction is a disease thing, and she's saying on the other side of that coin, there still do exist a subset of, it's a total moral failing. And so how do you do the equivalent with those people?
How do you get people to consider? It gets back to the same, don't you think, Zach, the same motivational interviewing question. People will only stop doing one thing and do another thing if they feel able to do it and they feel that it'll be better for their lives.
Yeah.
So the Life Process program is a way of encouraging people to feel stronger by giving them certain skills, by rehearsing and reviewing and reframing their own lives to recognize good things they've done in the past, skills and assets and resources that they already have. They have to, refocus on their positive and their agency side. And that's one thing. And on the other hand, and we brought this up with methadone, they have to be persuaded, they have to believe that the opposite of what dope sick and everything else is telling them, which is, well, you can't beat this drug. You're not stronger than this drug. And so, and of course, the cigarette exercise is an example of that. You mean you quit smoking with no professional assistance, the hardest drug addiction to quit? Wow. You're something else. And we use that technique in the Life Process program. often people have quit one thing and now they're thinking about quitting another thing. And so the quick answer is you're kind of an expert on how to quit an addiction. And you know that people can quit addictions because you've already done that. At the same time, that has to be, and you've described, I think, very well, and maybe you'll describe it again, the process by which you work with the person to enable them to not, and the psychologist of Stanford, and this woman putting this question, is this a woman who asked this question?
Yeah.
A kind of a sensitivity, an ability to say to the person, I wonder if there could be something better for you. I like you, or I care for you. I want to be helpful. And, can we think around whether and how you can go by that process? By the way, I think Charles Barkley is a commentator on TNT. I mean, I know he's a commentator on basketball. And Charles Barkley is a guy who drinks alcohol and has gotten in trouble at bars. And he told this story. He was driving along, there's a big crowd of people, and there was a guy on the side of the road who said, please give me $10, I need it to buy booze. And Charles Barkley stopped his car, got out, and he tried to give him $20. He says, for God's sake, the guy's honest. And the guy only would take $10. Because the guy's doing some kind of harm reduction. He wants $10 for the booze.
Yeah.
And so Charles Barkley's I think he's the only guy on television who would be allowed to give that answer. The guy's being honest. Instead of saying, I want it for a sandwich, I had to give him the money.
That is funny. There's an element of human nature that comes into play. I'm certainly not qualified to speak as any sort of authority on evolutionary psychology, nor do I find it's always interesting enough or mattering enough. There is like a perception I have about human nature. There's a reason why I think the cigarette, have you ever quit cigarettes example works better than have you ever quit opioids. It's partly mythology, right, that you talked about, but there's something about the smoking cigarettes. Like you quit that, it's sort of like you quit spitting a lot. And with opioids, there's this narrative about it that it's warm and fuzzy like a hug. And so you take that, you want people to move beyond that. It's like, why do you want to move beyond a hug? So it's easy to get into that, I need methadone forever. And you just want to hug that person forever. There's a certain kind of person who can easily be persuaded into that. And at the same time, there's an element of disgust associated with somebody who's using drugs or seems deviant, because it's rather than just compassion and like let's invite this person into our lives, maybe they'll get better. There's a certain kind of person who has there's something wrong here, and so we need to distance ourselves from that person. It'd be better if that person would go away, because it's going to make things messy to involve the person in life. I'm not saying I'm not trying to draw a moral juxtaposition there. I'm just saying that I think people have different dispositions about how they handle situations that they don't understand, or people they don't understand.
Are you talking about the person that's reacting to the?
I'm saying that they're kind of, it's easy to understand why there's two broadly different ways of looking at drug use and what it means, both of which get carried away. So
as a kind of an observer or potential helper.
Right. So there's just as a person, a human, a citizen, the way you might think about it. Like there's the compassion side, but you should have compassion, but you can get too into compassion so much that you're actually not doing what's in the best interest or being a good listener or helping the person move along. And there's that moral side, which is, I was calling it kind of disgust, which you just kind of want to separate yourself from that person who's doing things that are not aligning with values that you share. And there's a way that you can be constructive in that sense too. You can say, what would it take to get you to certain kind of values? I'm just saying, as any person in the world, you can have you tend to lean toward one or the other of those things, and those stories can get out of control really quickly. You're saying it's the same thing applies as you do with that workshop, and you say, has anyone ever become a, you try to engage a person to explain what their own experiences are like and how they're similar to another person's experiences. You don't necessarily have to have super compassion, or you're not necessarily immune to being that working on you if you see things in a more moral lens.
Now, you've described, I think, the 3 points in the compass. You've described working with the person in a way where, I mean, the purpose is to get them to change, and the young person is doing something bothersome. I mean, you're in a position where, and most people in this field are, some problem has to arise before you're engaged. The second thing is you've got to get them to change without disapproving of them and making them believe, because it is in their own best interest, because you want them to be happy. You're not doing this because you're getting down on them. And then there's a third case that you mentioned earlier on about dealing with former associates in your addiction. There's certain people you're not going to hang around with anymore. They don't live your life values. And of course, you don't have to hang around with them because it's your life. But sometimes it'll come into a situation, and I think you've dealt with this as well, where the person's behaving in a way, well, that you would personally disapprove of. And you've described that, haven't you? You know, there are times when you'll reflect with a child that they're doing something wrong. Was that an accurate statement?
Yeah.
And that's part of being a human being too. It's just not, I mean, I've more than once, I have grandchildren. And so I use this old grandfatherly trope. I say, well, you have to help your mother. I mean, my daughter was a single parent. I say, well, you have to help your mother out. I mean, she loves you and she's doing so many things for you. You can't make life harder for her. You have to help her.
Right.
And in that situation, ironically, children understand that and they believe that. So that's almost called appealing to people's better nature without being too heavy-handed about it. But at the same time, expressing your own real values.
I'll say one more thing, and we'll move on to the last question, which is a perfect one. There's a guy I've been following. He was a hostage negotiator. His name's Chris Voss. He worked for the FBI. He negotiated literally negotiated with terrorists and got them to release hostages and kidnap victims and things like that. And so this is like the extreme. This is like the ad absurdum. But he's talking to people and he has to get aligned with them in some human way, so that they can share some kind of goal, so these people come back alive. And so all of that to say, you can completely disagree with somebody's moral judgment on something or the way they're living their lives, but still want to get to a better place. You don't have to ever like that person in the end. If you're coming from that bent, to answer this woman's question, it'd be nice if we didn't think about people who are using drugs as someone you just could never like, but you can still help a person and be constructive as a citizen by relating to human experience and using that as a way to lift up whatever some common shared goals are.
If you were a hostage negotiator, wouldn't your mind tend to be, well, we got to get this hostage out. That's my job.
Yep.
But wouldn't it be also in the back of your mind, well, I'd like this person not to take any more hostages, or
yeah, absolutely,
to the robbery. So it is a therapeutic interaction, isn't it?
It's absolutely. That's how he explains it. He says, you want to say, let these fucking people go, just to get them out of there. Stop doing what you're doing. But so how do you you have to get somebody to feel, I should stop doing this. I should let people go. How do you do that? You have to connect with the person, and they need to do the next right thing. And they need to believe that they came up with the idea. It's a phrase he uses, let them have my way, which is interesting. And that's very therapeutic, and it's a way of thinking about it.
I mean, Bill Miller's retired, whatever that means, from being like Mr. Motivational Interviewing, except they've written, I always throw out these impossible 2,000 books. They've written other books about how motivational interviewing sort of works for everything.
Yeah.
And so recently, I don't do that many clinical interactions, and sometimes people make requests for me, and then I throw it out to our coaches, and then sometimes I don't realize that what the person's asking is for me. And so a man who's well known in the field of extirpating people from cults. He's a cult rescuer, contacted me. And, obviously, if the person doesn't want to leave the cult, they're not going to leave the cult. You can't kidnap them. So it's a straight, whatever you're talking about. It's the same with all of these situations, the hostage and motivational interviewing. And, I was paid as a consultant, but I said, I'm afraid that 90% of the things I'm going to tell you or discuss with you are things that you kind of already know from doing cold extrication activities that, and the primary one of that is, how does a person recognize that they're not the happiest in doing the best thing for themselves, as well as for their loved ones, and to be alerted to that, among others, and for their whole life scope, in interacting with them to get them to leave the cult. We have a cult member coach, by the way, for people.
Former cult member, yeah.
Right.
So he would say the same thing.
He was brought up in a cult, and then I guess you might say he joined a drug cult.
Mm-hmm.
And then, he was in a therapy community program. And so he knows cults inside and out.
So the short answer to you got people who cast moral judgment on people who are using drugs. How do you get them to think about that a little bit differently? Everything that we've been talking about all day now sort of relates to how you might talk to somebody of that persuasion. You listen to them like you would want them to listen to the person using drugs and see what makes them tick and see if they can make a connection there.
And one basic thing we're saying, you can be a moral human being, but you have to remove moral judgment from your interacting with somebody.
Yeah, there you go. Last question, perfect for you. This is, sometimes you make statements about this and they seem pessimistic, cynical, rightly so. And so I think someone's trying to take you to task here and what you really believe. How long do you think it will take for the negative sociological addiction is a disease narrative to be entirely removed from both the recovery and medical industries? Could it ever happen?
I'm 75. And the current thing, that the other part of this podcast is how and you just testified in Oklahoma, how we're in a new war on drugs. Opioids are inherently bad. Don't take them at all, which is unbelievable. And we talk, they can watch it. Anna Lemke was called to task in a trial for misstating both sides of that equation, for misstating how often people become addicted when they're prescribed medications, claiming it was 25%, while the best research shows it's less than 5%. And two, failing to recognize and accept the value and the benefit of providing pain relief for people. And in fact, that's a patient's right. That's a medical, ethical obligation to provide that for people. And yet she's writing bestsellers. She's referred to in all of these films now, because the title of her bestseller is something like How Doctors Were Led Astray to Give People Drugs and They Became Addicted and Couldn't Stop, and Why It's Impossible to Stop. And that's a version of the whole drug war thing. And I've just been shocked by how readily that's been adopted by, we've talked about, I was in reaction to drugs, to dope sick, all the progressive the commentators, people I really respect, Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski, Nicole Wallace, who's a genius, all just buy that bullshit coming down the pike, that opioids are inherently addictive. And I also pointed out in the other part of the podcast, somebody just wrote in the Boston Globe, 50 years after Archie Brodsky and I began researching love and addiction, which included delving into the research of Lee Robbins about the Vietnam War. To make that story a long story short, most of the guys who took opioids and heroin in Vietnam didn't become addicted. An overwhelming majority, over 90% of the ones who did, quickly desisted their addiction when they returned to the United States. And she used that. And so there's this article in the Globe saying, we've never learned that lesson after 50 years. And then in the movie, The Pharmacist, they interview Ann Lemke, and she says, well, we know how addictive drugs are, opioids are, opium. She called it opium. They used heroin and opium in Vietnam. Because look at the drug epidemic that took place with the Vietnam soldiers, even though the underlying reality of that Vietnam experience is cast things in exactly the opposite direction. And so you and I discussed, and we ended on this in that part of the podcast, why are people so wedded to this? And you said they like a big bad villain. And you said the big bad villain was the farm companies. They like a big bad villain to be the drug. It's called, they're still demonizing drugs, which is part of what we've been discussing. If you look at a painkiller, you say, well, it kills pain. And some people are attached to that. And some people may be over attached to that. But that's not the drug. You can't demonize drugs. You can't impute to drugs the power to do that thing.
The big bad villain gives everyone something to do. You can start requesting or demanding that drugs be taken away, or you can throw rocks at the bad guy. And everyone gets to do something with a pitchfork, with a rock in your hand, with your rhetoric. So everyone
and punishment. It is ironic how much a part of this is punishment. Yeah, and people are getting away from punishing the drug user, thank God, but now they're punishing other people.
Yeah,
they're punishing pain doctors, a lot of whom are just like trying to do the best thing. They're just trying to help people. And I mean, there are drug mills and they can do whatever they want to them, but there are people who've lost their license through normal, what they believe best practices, medical kind of practice. And then I threw one last thing. And so there's like blaming things on an external figure, believing drugs are bad. And then the third part of that is the addiction model of I just got something in Medscape today, and they just repeated that myth. Oh, how many people, just go in for a knee problem and end up taking prescription drugs and they become addicted? And the answer is 1% go through that particular ritual.
Right.
And yet that model, that belief is so embedded in our culture that it can't be escaped. So I have become this recent, I mean, when I my late age, being aware, watching Lemke talk or The Pharmacist, where they're still refuting what Vietnam proved, that people will take a drug under certain circumstances when they're in deprived circumstances, and then readily not need that drug, the most addictive drug in the world, even when it's available to them, because they've got enough other things available to them. Learning that model seems to be impossible. And one thing we can talk about is the pandemic, which people often, we don't know what the ultimate consequences of the pandemic are to be. It seems like people are going to have less intimate contact. So that's not good. It seems that probably in the end, inequality will be aggravated. And I say that because people point out that service workers you know, they can't work at home, and people, there's sort of like people can work at home, and people can't work at home, and people who can't work at home either take a lot more health risks or they don't have any kind of income. And so just this morning, for some crazy reason, I was looking up the economic inequality index in the world. Some world health body does it. I don't think it's who. The United States is number 51, and all 50 countries ahead of it are in Africa and Latin America, except for one, Turkey, which is a little bit Asian. Every other European country is lower in inequality than us. Ireland, for some, I'm very interested in Ireland, was 125th. We were 51st. And one of the primary things we're talking about is people who don't have enough, you know, deaths of despair, people who don't have enough motivation to carry on in life in a normal, positive, functioning way. And that division in people, that equation is not improving.
So at least what you've done here is you've laid out what it would take to get rid of that mythology in medicine and literature and rhetoric. But that you can't give a clear answer on who could guess. You know, it would take something completely unexpected to happen, something so different than what we're used to happen for people to buy into some broader basic concept that they would need to in order to escape it. That who could possibly guess? And as things are going now, you could say fairly safely never, and that wouldn't be a crazy guess even if something did change.
You and I actually had this discussion. Something crazy has happened. There was a trial in California with an extremely careful and scrupulous judge and some very, very talented lawyers.
Yeah.
And they showed Anna Lemke and the California bodies of government that were suing the drug companies were full of shit. Yeah. That everything they said was false. And then I said to you, oh, do you think this will have much of an impact? And, you know, your guesses were, well, they're going to try and recall the judge. And they're going to talk about, I don't know, how the lawyers fooled people, you know, right. And right. How the experts, had a couple of experts testify against Lemke, you know, they'll probably cancel them. And the point is, the tidal wave is so great in one direction. That was an extraordinary event that a court decided that. I would think and it's published in all of the medical, in all the legal journals. But I don't expect that to turn the tide either. Although, you know, we done a podcast, and I'm going to write a blog post about look at this amazing thing that's happened to try and get people's attention. But Vietnam didn't get people's attention and change how they saw things. Right.
So maybe there'd be strength in numbers if those events continue to occur, and then they could be at the forefront, but who knows?
But okay. This isn't a woman who asked this question or a man?
No, this is a man.
You know, I welcome optimism. You have to believe in life. You have to be optimistic to live.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's good grounds for thinking we've already begun beyond the crest in global warming, that, you know, the oceans and the carbon dioxide in the air, the ocean is warming in ways that cannot be reversed, that we've already headed over the precipice. And yet there are people who go out there and keep saying, well, we can still make it. And God love those people. I love those people.
Right.
Even though I don't believe it. You don't always replace, what's the name of that young girl in Sweden?
Oh yeah, God, why can't I remember her name now?
I don't know, maybe you can look.
I hear it every day. Everyone knows who you're talking about, so it doesn't matter. God,
you know, maybe we're going to end this because this ties back into something else we talk about in the podcast. You know, labeling things as trauma. She, as a young teenager, individually went outside with a sign of Swedish Parliament.
Greta Thunberg, by the way.
Greta Thunberg, right. And sat there. And at the time, she was like 13, and you're going, oh my God, how can a human being do that? And she's in a way changed the world.
Yeah.
There's now a whole worldwide youth movement. And so I watched this documentary about her. Her parents are like, regular middle-class parents. They were worried about her. Greta Thunberg, what's her name?
Thunberg, yeah. Greta Thunberg, yeah.
She doesn't have a lot of friends. You can start applying labels to her left and right.
Yeah, yeah.
Her idea of a good time is not, her parents probably, when she, said, well, maybe you should go to the dance, Greta, or join a film club. And, Greta Thunberg wasn't going to do that. And, if you've been around, especially in the United States, you can start saying, and you can come up with 3 or 4 labels instantaneously. She's not a people person in terms of going to a cafe. On the other hand, she's engaged with the world. She's changed the world, and she does interact, of course, with people, because there's now a whole movement around youth for reversing climate change. And God willing, maybe it'll actually, she's like Superman, Superwoman. It might actually work, and we might actually save the earth. So, we get back to an old theme. Here's a person who could be, and I think one year she didn't talk to anybody beside her parents all year. I think she stopped going to school, who's transformed whatever her personality is into a world-saving, beyond belief positive connection to the universe. She's kind of a role model for not diseasifying things.
So we have to act as though things will change, even if we're cynical about things. And if nothing else, that gives people like you and me a purpose, which is good in and of itself, but it may have the spin-off effect of actually doing the damn thing that we want to do, energizing and mobilizing other people to be able to do it in a way we haven't thought about. So, don't lose hope, but also probably shouldn't get too complacent that it's going to change.
End on that summary. I think that's a pretty excellent summary.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Tanton. We did a marathon session.
All right. Pleasure's mine entirely.